Over here, stranger. You didn't click on this video just so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire. Then again, maybe you did. Resident Evil 4 is both the game I own the most copies of and the game I have played from start to finish the most. And this won't be some pre-release review where Capcom only allows certain footage. We're going to be diving deep on this remake. And after all this, we can go play some bingo. Trust me, I know a good bar. So, I talked a lot in my Metroid Prime Remastered review about how I love introductions, especially intros to games, and feel free to check out that review, by the way. And if you're sick of me talking about intros, this video is timestamped, so definitely hop around. And in that Metroid review, I alluded to Resident Evil 4 also having one of my favorite introductions, both in video games and in general. In the original, the game opens with Leon reflecting on his past and setting the foundation for why Leon is in this
lonely and rural part of Europe.
The president's daughter has been kidnapped, and Leon has to save her. From this intro scene, the player is basically thrown feet first into a combat situation, and before you know it, the entire village, including a man with a chainsaw, is trying to kill you, all ending with this beautiful cherry on top.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And as someone who has spent 6 months in a lonely and rural part of Europe, I can 100% confirm I did play a lot of bingo there. Actually, disco bingo every Wednesday, so kudos to Capcom for the accuracy there. And the original intro was masterful in how it goes from 0 to 100. And the scenario it thrusts the player in is so effective. Because the player's so new to the controls, the village sequence is actually quite scary. The village sequence quickly then gets the player up to speed with said controls, and in subsequent playthroughs, the player sees a marked improvement on what was once a daunting area is now kind of a playground. Apart from the gameplay intro, the intro masterfully sets up a nightmare scenario for Leon and illustrates just how amazing the village setting will be for the next third of the game or so. And this is tied with Metroid for the best intro of the GameCube era for me personally, so can the remake capture that lightning in a bottle? Well, I only have a few issues with the remake's intro, and luckily most of them are in the very beginning. The opening shot to the game is entirely irrelevant. I understand it ties in all the disappearances in the area, which you find these people later in the game, but the original intro was Leon's story. It's 1998. I'll never forget it. It jumps from Leon's quick recap to Leon being in Europe. The remake starts with this disconnected shot and then jumps to Leon's background and then back to Spain. I think it's a weird flow. And there are a few slight modifications to the introduction cutscene with the police, including one of the officers just wandering off into the woods. And this is some shitty horror movie character shit. Like, you know this place is notorious for kidnappings and murders. Why do you wander off to investigate without at least alerting Leon or the other officer? And this is just another change I don't really get. I think it's weird that the sun rises as you approach the village. Maybe someone can help me understand this one in the comments. It's just kind of weird that you start at night just before daybreak. My biggest issue with the intro as a whole is the first encounter. In the original game, especially back in 2005, you had no idea what was going on. All you knew is that these guys are sure as hell not zombies. But especially up through the intro, as far as the player is concerned, these are just kind of villagers. There's not much until later in the game, but especially up through the intro, as far as the player is concerned, these are just kind of villagers. It's not until much later in the game, at night, where it's 100% confirmed that the parasite Las Plagas is controlling the villagers. And there are some winks and nods, but you don't actually see the parasite with your own eyes until several hours in. Here, on the very first encounter, Capcom spills the beans. Maybe they did it because the secret is 18 years old, but I think it really weakens the moment where you do see the fully matured parasite, and it lessens the overall mystery of what's going on in the village in the early hours of the game. The parasite can also be seen living in the severed limbs of enemies, but I think that would have just been a more subtle and easier to miss than the very first encounter, making it very clear what's going on. These people are not acting of their own volition. The rest of the intro is honestly pretty great though, and you learn pretty quickly about some of the stuff we'll be talking about in the gameplay and story sections, like how knives function completely differently, your laser pointer is long gone, there's no saving that dog, and Leon does things a bit differently, including with knives and doors, and geez, it looks like inflation hit rural Spain pretty damn hard. But most importantly, the same core results are delivered. The village sequence is wildly intense, and if Capcom could get the intro right, which they largely did, then it's safe to say this remake is in good hands. And I mean that. I was really nervous going into this, especially considering Resident Evil Village, which Capcom's last full Resident Evil entry was a clear callback to Resident Evil 4, including the intro sequence, which simply didn't hit the same highs, and you can check out that review if you want. And the intro is a bit of a microcosm for my thoughts of the remake as a whole. Some questionable changes, but ultimately pretty damn good. For years, there have been debates online if Resident Evil 4 needed a remake at all, and actually please continue this debate down in the comments of the video, and on your way down there, why don't you stop by at the like and subscribe button. My Zelda Tears of the Kingdom video is likely going to be my next video, so please subscribe so you don't miss it. And there was a fair question there, because where the original trilogy used static camera angles, Resident Evil 4 is easily the most playable of the older games in the series. But if there was an argument to be made for remaking Resident Evil 4, the strongest would be that some aspects of the controls did not age as gracefully. The main criticisms being Leon cannot move while shooting, there are no weapon shortcuts forcing you to pause the game to swap out guns, and Leon still uses tank controls with limited camera manipulation. And unsurprisingly, the remake rectifies almost all of these issues, some in interesting ways which we're going to need to dive into, but generally speaking, playing the remake feels like how you remember playing the original. And this core essence of the original was precise aiming to drive combat scenarios. Leon could shoot specific areas of enemies for different effects. Shoot the enemy's arm to force them to drop their weapon, shoot their legs to stop them in their tracks, shoot their head to set up for a melee attack. And all of these options paired with environmental interactions like shooting red barrels, and that empowered the player to expertly manage crowds. And careful consideration needed to be made for the most efficient method of handling enemies, as resources were often scarce. The essence of the original lives on in the remake. The core of the combat is still shooting the right part of the right enemy with the right gun at the right time to maximize damage while minimizing resource drain. And many modern creature comforts were given to the player. You can now move and shoot, have weapon shortcuts, and you can move the camera. But I want to explore more deeply some of these changes and what they mean for the core gameplay, and let's start with the weapon shortcuts. This was something that was actually introduced in the Oculus VR port of Resident Evil 4, and I was worried going into the remake Capcom might try to do something like The Last of Us, where everything has to be done in real time, but you still have your attaché case and it still pauses the game. And if you want, you can never use the weapon shortcuts the entire playthrough. And I think this is a win-win for newcomers and veterans alike. It does cut tension down a bit to be able to pause and regroup, but there's plenty going on during combat, and I'm glad that we're not mixing herbs on the fly. While moving and shooting is officially here, the trade-off is reticle bloom. Capcom is effectively encouraging players to mostly plant their feet while shooting, which does keep tension high. And I find the ludicrous bloom of the unstocked Red 9 to basically be a callback to the original, where you basically have to be completely standing still to shoot. However, I feel this kind of flies in the face of the core game design of precise shooting. The original game gave Leon quite literally laser accuracy on every weapon because precision was so important to controlling combat scenarios. The remake is just as, if not more important, but accuracy has just been kneecapped, and I do find that a bit frustrating. A big point in landing certain shots is to go in for a melee attack, or get some knife swings. So let's talk about that knife. In the original, the knife was arguably the best tool in the game, mostly for its infinite ammo. In the remake, the knife has a durability bar, with certain actions affecting durability more often than others. And before we get deep into the knife, I just want to call out that there are non-repairable boot and kitchen knives in the game. And I really wish that these were auto-selected over your repairable knife. It would keep your inventory clean, and it would keep your repairable knife in action longer. But the knife has added functionality in the game, including a parry and effectively get out of jail free card if an enemy grabs you. And actions which save Leon from damage do more to durability than the knife would take on offensive actions, with breaking free from grabs doing a solid amount of durability damage, and understandably stopping a chainsaw doing a lot of durability. And I mentioned Leon has a parry as part of this kit, with almost everything including bullets being parryable. And the original game allowed Leon to shoot projectiles out of the air, but a decent amount of planning had to go into executing that, where here you simply hit a button. And landing a perfect parry opens enemies up to melee attacks as if you had shot them in the head or the knee. Landing a standard parry prevents damage at the cost of knife durability, and let's start with the standard parries. The window is ridiculously generous on these, to the point where you can just kind of spam the parry button as you anticipate an attack. I think in a survival horror game, the standard parry is far too generous, and only the perfect parry should exist, at the very least for the hardcore and up difficulties. So I've emphasized how important pulling off melee is, both in the original and the remake. It's both free damage and crowd control. And the original game forced the player into a risk-reward dance, where the enemy would be put into a meleeable scenario and the player had to decide, is it worth the risk to move in? Would there be enough time to get to the enemy before they were unstunned, and was there a clear path that enemy or another would be able to attack Leon? In the remake, this still applies, but the player can feel much safer engaging knowing they have both a largely free parry tool and a perfect parry tool, which can further enhance Leon's offensive capabilities. So I think the parry is okay, but slapping a durability bar onto a knife to balance it doesn't fully solve the problem, and it kind of works as extra health at a relatively low cost, which doesn't sit too well with me. And the last major update is how Leon moves, and unsurprisingly, he moves like how you would expect a player having a full camera-controlled third-person action hero would move. I do wish that Leon maybe had a shove or something, and he could feel a bit sluggish when trying to make tight corners and doing 180s, but otherwise, no real complaints. All of this, the parrying, the camera controls, and weapon shortcuts, is balanced with much faster and more aggressive enemies. Where the original had enemies politely taking their turns to attack you, it is made pretty clear pretty quickly. Things move at least twice as fast. This is like going from Smash 64 to Melee, and I absolutely love the brisk pace of it all. Leon really feels like John Wick when the player is in a flow state, which I think is an important point. The player gets much better at the combat throughout the original, and the same is true here. It is genuinely cool that the player gets better, and that speaks to the well-designed system and well-designed enemies and engagements throughout the campaign. And that mostly summarizes the core of the experience, but I have a few other thoughts on gameplay, starting with
Ashley Graham, the president's daughter,
who Leon needs to protect throughout about half of the game. In the original, Ashley had a health bar and could often quite literally be thrown in a dumpster and forgotten about. Here, she operates on a 2-hit system. At the first hit, she is incapacitated, and after another hit, she dies. And the only thing that's unchanged here is enemies prioritize grabbing Ashley, and if they take her out of the room, the mission is failed. This is a very hot take, I know, but I actually really liked Ashley in the original, and I'm glad they removed most of her hiding spots in the remake, but I actually prefer the health bar from the 2-hit system. At least I could boost her health through an unfortunate catapult projectile. In the remake, it felt like I got some cheap deaths because of this 2-hit system. The remake introduces side quests to the game for the ability to purchase special items from the merchant. And in general, the remake's map design allows for easy backtracking and allows for treasure hunting and side questing. So thumbs up and good job, Capcom. Unfortunately, while I love the blue medallions being expanded from the original game and the idea of mini bosses, a fair amount of these side quests are frankly dog shit. Like killing 3 rats? Seriously, guys? And this quest is reused several times. Luckily for subsequent playthroughs, the bad ones can easily be skipped. What turned out to be a total hit for me was the expanded shooting range. Rewards for playing allow Leon to try his hand at a gacha machine for attaché charms, which act as perks. And I was very addicted to hitting those high scores for one more pull at the gacha machine. It's super cute that the charms are modeled from the original Resident Evil 4. And the first time I heard the bonus time music, I had an ear-to-ear smile. Probably my favorite callback, in the entire remake. And I also love Ashley striking that classic pose on the barrel, and she encourages you while you shoot on the range. Okay, 2 more quick things. The original Resident Evil 4 was a legendary game, which future games borrowed heavily from. And one of those things was QuickTime events. Yes, we got a revolutionary way to approach making third-person shooters. But what did it cost us? Well, QuickTime events flooding games. And in the remake, these are mostly removed. And there is a famous QuickTime event boss in the original, which after playing the remake, I really wish they had kept and unchanged, and just kind of used it as a throwback. Lastly, I wish we could still shoot through doors. There's tons of destructible environments all over the game. I don't know why we can't shoot the doors anymore, but that's not really a big deal. The Resident Evil remakes are not afraid to shake up and rework the story to fit into a more cohesive whole for the series, and this game is no different. A fair number of changes were made here, and while many are relatively innocuous or unoffensive, I wanted to draw attention to some changes I liked and some that I dislike. And I'd like to start by addressing the removal of the flirtatious behavior of the characters, which will be used as a stepping stone to further examine these character changes. So the original Resident Evil 4 had a fair amount of flirting in all directions. Leon to Hunnigan.
You know, you're kind of cute without those glasses. Give me your number when I get back.
Luis to Ashley.
I see that the president's equipped his daughter with ballistics, too.
How rude!
And Ashley to Leon.
After you take me back to my place, how about we do some overtime?
Sorry.
And yeah, you get the point. The Resident Evil 4 VR port removed almost all these lines, and you can check out my admittedly old, probably not as smooth review for my thoughts on that. And their absence here is a bit disappointing. And this is only disappointing because for the most part, there wasn't anything to replace these characterizations with. Let's take Hunnigan, for example. Her main purpose is to assist Leon in the mission. And the only other thing her and Leon ever really talk about is Leon flirting with her. And without these lines, Hunnigan's presence is even less than in the VR remake or the original. She is more bland as a character and effectively is not used. And when she is used, she is extremely flat. I just wish if Capcom wanted to remove what was arguably sexual harassment in the workplace by Leon's part, that they had found something else for the two to bounce back and forth. And I think the same is genuinely true of Ashley. There wasn't really anything to replace these lines with. In a world of Last of Us, God of War, BioShock Infinite, I'd really hoped that there would be just a bit more banter between Leon, Ashley, and the other characters. Like, Ashley never talks to the merchant here. There are a few little conversations, but they come off extremely forced simply because there really isn't much to these characters. It would have been neat if she asked Leon about Operation Javier, or that knife that he has from Resident Evil 2, or why his pistol says what it says on it. But instead, we get
this for me.
Leave it to me. I'm actually pretty good at this stuff.
And I'm not asking for as much as what maybe Kratos and Atreus go through, but Leon and Ashley go from basically not talking to one cutscene playing and their relationship dynamic changing completely. There could have been room for more organic growth throughout the gameplay. And Luis might be my least favorite character change because he is affected the most by having his character neutered with little to replace it. Without getting into spoilers, Capcom gives him more time, but I don't feel that that time is used wisely. Leon goes from hating him to liking him with no organic transition, and Luis himself is so vague when confronted about all of the stuff going on in the story that the added screen time doesn't do a lot when you end up basically just reading stuff in journals anyway. And that's a shame because they really did flesh out Luis's story, but it's bafflingly hidden behind these journals and diaries. Capcom also chose to link Luis to the village, Las Plagas, and the greater RE story in a way that is ultimately a bit contrived. And let's get one thing straight. Leon is not a good dude. He kills hundreds of people in some very fucked up ways. Luis does some fucked up shit too, without getting into spoilers. Removing these flirtatious lines doesn't exactly clear them as noble heroes if that was Capcom's intention. Sadler is another character that I think was done a bit dirty. Resident Evil 4 has 3 core areas, village, castle, and island, with 3 minor antagonists to match: the Big Cheese, Salazar, and Krauser, and Sadler being the overarching baddie. and the original, Sadler is physically present in the village and the castle. But here, his presence has been relegated to just the island. He makes appearances through the Plagas, but they are very vague and short in the remake. Capcom has a recurring theme in the narrative of change.
This time, it can be different. Raccoon City. You know, after the incident, the world changed. You try to save one person, 100 others die. I guess I changed too.
You? Leon S. Kennedy. You haven't changed. We're changing course now.
Lines like "it has to be different," "have I changed," and "we're changing course." This theme is also played out in Ashley stepping up throughout the narrative. I guess. All of this is just so cringe to me. I'm gonna use a gamer word here, but there is some wild ludonarrative dissonance with Ashley. A few times later in the narrative, she steps up. This starts with little things like opening doors to bigger things like throwing lanterns and culminates in her operating a crane. But like, when the game's being played, the second Ashley is kidnapped or Leon dies or the designer set up a scenario where Leon needs to save Ashley, all of this character development completely collapses on itself. And as for the theme of change, I just don't feel like they did anything with it or proved it in any way. And yes, things happen where Raccoon City, which Leon could not have stopped, let's just be blunt about that, are not repeated in this narrative. And rolls eyes, people do change, but in the context of Resident Evil 5, 6, and 7, and 8, nothing changes and nothing is different. And I just think it's weird that they doubled down on it repeatedly. And I had hoped that Leon's little soliloquy at the beginning would have set him up for more of a backstory and more character development. But I've already explained there isn't a whole lot of extra development, so this isn't the case. I think this is the biggest missed opportunity in the Resident Evil 4 remake. Capcom decided to touch the story, but I don't feel like they touched it in a meaningful way. They did make it fit better into the meta story, sure, and most of the structure changes and missing content don't really bother me. I'll miss the gondola and the U3 boss fight, sure, but most of it is inoffensive. But I do think they weakened a lot of characters and failed to develop them in any meaningful way, and part of this remake feels like it's stuck back in 2005. The original Resident Evil 4 is known for having some of the best presentation of its time. The graphics fully utilize the GameCube in a way which is rarely seen due to its poor sales. The cutscenes were well directed, and while not Metal Gear Solid, were certainly impressive, and the art design as a whole has made this game age visually well to this day, at least in my eyes. And the remake has a lot of value in its presentation. The RE engine continues to sing visually, the art direction is mostly faithfully recreated, and I think where the remake really excels is in the soundstage and actually being able to generate some horror. The sound of this game is simply incredible. Hearing chanting, growls, or muttering just out of eyeshot is always impressively done. And all of this is mixed together with impressively moody atmospheric sounds, and it all has such good directionality. You always know exactly where each sound is coming from, and it all comes together to actually succeed in creating some horror scenarios. When you have just a couple pistol shots and one magnum round, and you hear a regenerator deep within the darkness that you know you have to explore, wow, does Resident Evil 4 Remake really work. And when night falls in the village and you hear yourself surrounded by Ganado with no way of seeing them, my goodness. And I want to give a shout out to Ashley's voice actor for really selling how horrifying everything is. Her screams are genuinely unsettling, in contrast to the original, which used Sandy Cheek's actor, who usually sounded more annoyed than horrified.
Oh, you pervert!
And when this does eventually get ported to PlayStation VR 2, assuming it behaves similar to Village, I think this could have a case for being the best VR game of all time. And that's no surprise, because I gave the original Oculus port my game of the year. Older reviews, so the quality's a bit scuffed, but feel free to check that out. Now, that is a lot of praise, but I am disappointed in the presentation in both the console and PC ports. I just want to be crystal clear here. Resident Evil 4 is effectively an infinite money glitch for Capcom. The original has not only sold tens of millions, but catapulted the larger Resident Evil franchise into more mainstream success. So, to me, extra time, care, and budget should have been put into this remake, if only to set up the remake for 18 years of further success. But there are problems with every major version of the game. The Xbox has control issues, PlayStation 5 has visual issues, all console versions have general graphical issues like the hair strands not being lit properly, and all console versions run at an unlocked frame rate, which is highly distracting. And the PC has crashing issues due to VRAM. And there are more issues here, but the point is no version got out unscathed, and that's truly disappointing. Capcom has a disappointing history with consoles and PC ports for RE Engine titles, and it seems that the trend has continued here. Resident Evil 4 Remake is an action horror game to its very core. The DNA of the game always blended the two from the inspirations taken to create the game, and I want to quickly call out some of the films which were inspirations to the game's inception, starting with the film Dagon, which, well, kind of is Resident Evil 4 in a lot of ways. It takes place in a Spanish fishing town, which falls for a cult. Sounds pretty familiar to Resident Evil 4's story, no? But fittingly, it is a horror movie with touches of action. And speaking of action, the protagonist Leon is named from the movie Leon the Professional, and one of Leon's handguns, the Matilda, is another character in that film with plenty of action. And wouldn't you know it, but the same director, Luc Besson, also directed La Femme Nikita, another action film which was used heavily for the creation of Ada Wong. And circling back to horror, there is an obvious inspiration from The Wicker Man as another crazed village horror. And speaking personally, I love the horror village setting. Midsommar is one of my favorite movies of all time from my favorite new director, Ari Aster, and here's a hot take, I think Paranormal Activity Next of Kin is the best one. But the point is that the village setting for horror has solidly been proven as effective. So Resident Evil 4's very core and DNA is action horror, and I think it's really cool that developers were committed to the idea from the very start. I know the back half of this review has had a fair bit of criticism, but I really do like the Resident Evil 4 remake. I've seen a lot of outlets kind of automatically forgive the game for not having the impact of the original. And I disagree with that sentiment. The original Resident Evil 4 was revolutionary. If the game had played it safe, it would have been like the previous three. Tank controls, zombies, hell, maybe even Raccoon City. But Resident Evil 4 stepped up. It pioneered third-person shooting, and the blueprint would be iterated on for the next 20 years. And it wasn't all perfect. Tank controls, no hot swap weapons, a jank cover system, rushed late into the game, but it tried. And aside from a few misfires, a lot landed. So while I didn't expect the remake to change video games for the next 20 years, it theoretically could have. So where the original game went wild, the remake just plays it safe. And that is fine, but for a game whose theme is about changing course, I do find it a bit hypocritical. I guess that's kind of where I conclude with this remake. It is very good and modernizes the original largely in terms of controls, even though a lot of the most meaningful modifications have previously been made in the VR port. So when comparing the remake to the original, I gotta say the original is still king. But the remake is a great way to experience Resident Evil 4, and it fits comfortably in my top 3 favorites in the entire franchise as a whole, alongside the original Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 2 Remake. But why couldn't it have been revolutionary?
Oh, you pervert!